was a Civil War history buff for many years. I read a lot of books about the history of the war and the battles and generals, and I started thinking about how I could combine my profession, economics, with my hobby, Civil War history. And the more I read about Abraham Lincoln, the more I realized that he spent 25 years involved in nothing but economic policy debates as a member of the Whig Party. And so I thought, well, here's a story that really hasn't been fully told yet. And so I started writing articles that were published in academic journals, and those turned into my first book, The Real Lincoln.
What was Lincoln's views on economics?
Lincoln didn't have much of a view on economics. He was slavishly devoted to the Whig Party economic policy platform, which was Alexander Hamilton's economic policy platform of the American system. And so Abraham Lincoln devoted a quarter of a century of his life in politics to promoting the American system. No Whig politician was a more forceful proponent of a national bank than Abraham Lincoln was in the pre-war years. The Whig Party became the party of the moneyed interests of the North, and that's who Abraham Lincoln hitched his wagon to politically. And so he was a sort of a mouthpiece for high protectionist tariffs, central bank, and corporate welfare, which at the time was called internal improvements. And Lincoln got the nomination from the Republican Party, by the way, by presenting his protectionist credentials to the Pennsylvania delegation of the Republican National Convention. Pennsylvania was a key state, had a lot of delegates. He knew he had to win Pennsylvania to get the nomination. And so he had a friend of his bring all of his speeches on tariffs, promoting high protectionist tariffs, to all the Republican Party big shots in Pennsylvania, and that's how he got the nomination. So it's not a stretch to say that he owed his nomination and election to presidency on his lifelong, or at least his adult lifelong, devotion to protectionist tariffs and the economic agenda of the Whig Party, which was basically the economic agenda of the moneyed elite of the northern states.
With the national bank, with tariffs, with internal improvements, was there a shift of money from the South to the North?
Well, sure. It was very similar to the American revolutionaries who thought that they were being plundered by the King of England and that they had lost their rights as Englishmen, which they were supposed to have. If you see what some of the Southern statesmen were saying, and even a couple of decades before the war broke out, they thought that the New England Yankees were breaking the constitutional compact and were attempting to use the government to plunder them. If you look at the voting record of North and South in Congress on all of these things, Southern statesmen from Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, all of them vetoed the so-called American system, the national bank, the high tariffs, and the corporate welfare subsidies. And so there was a very clear-cut separation between North and South. There were Northern free traders, there were Northern opponents of a central bank, but overwhelmingly the supporters of a central bank and protectionist tariffs were from the North, and overwhelmingly the opponents were from the South.
Was Lincoln successful in implementing the American system?
Right. This system had been argued over in politics for 70 years and more, and the arguing stopped during the Civil War when the whole thing was put into place by the Republican Party. We had high protection of tariffs in the 50% range that would last for more than 60 years. In June of 1861, with the war just being started, Lincoln called a special session of Congress to get the ball rolling on the Pacific Railway bill to begin subsidizing railroad corporations to build a railroad to California. And then you had the National Currency Acts and the Legal Tender Acts that nationalized the money supply and created the greenbacks. The Consumer Price Index, as most people are familiar with, about doubled within a year after the creation of the greenbacks. Lincoln himself signed 10 tariff-raising bills, and so the tariff rate on average was in the 50% range by the end of the Civil War, and it remained there until 1913 when the income tax came into play. And so the whole thing was put into place during the Lincoln administration after being fought over in politics. And I tell people the government did all this as soon as it had the gunpowder and enough technology to force it on the rest of the country. That's my theory of why the war came when it did.